it's unlikely for most people that they will be replaced by AI.
Right.
But they might be replaced by somebody else who uses AI better than they do.
And that gives us humans time to learn AI and to interact with it. Hugo, thank you for taking time to speak with me. It's an honor and pleasure, as always, to speak with you and hang out with you. I've learned so much from you about this industry. I would love for you to talk to the audience and tell us about your background, starting from the very beginning and how you ended up in staffing and recruiting.
Well, thank you for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here. It really is a pleasure. So the brief whistle-stop tour, I grew up in South Africa, studied electronic engineering there, then studied some more electronic engineering out in England. I joined a startup at the time that we all did when I finished up a PhD at Cambridge, and then came to the US in 2001 to join McKinsey. I worked for them in New York. I worked for Lehman Brothers. My timing was not ideal there. And then after Lehman and a little bit at Barclays Capital, I ended up in Chicago working for Sears Holdings. At the time, Sears and Kmart was still a $35 billion retailer, and the intent was to turn that around. It was a really exciting opportunity. I spent a number of years with them, and then I got the offer to join a staffing company, which seemed like a good idea at the time. So I joined a company called CDI as the president of their commercial business.
Right.
And then I joined a company called CDI as the president of their professional business. And that was my first being thrown in at the deep end, introduction to staffing. They had some challenges.
Right.
From them, I went to EmployBridge, where I ended up initially as the president of the commercial division, and then ultimately as the chief operating officer.
Right.
And from EmployBridge, after a few months, I ended up at Kelly Services. Kelly, I think as folks may know, is a large public, long-standing staffing company. And there I was the president of the science, engineering, technology, and telecom division.
Right.
So it's been a fascinating ride, as it were. My life plan was not to end up in staffing, but that seems to be what happened.
Right.
But it's a fascinating industry to be a part of because you get exposure to so many different activities going on in the broader economy.
Right.
Because you're frequently providing labor support and solutions to clients in a multiplicity of different sectors. And it gives you a very interesting bird's eye view. Some might argue a worm's eye view, but gives you a view into the US economy that's unique.
Yeah, absolutely. We talked about how a lot of the stuff that happens in the staffing and recruiting are many times lead indicators of how the US economy is going to evolve. And we talked about how things happening at the mid-level, at the lower level, and at the high level are also the combination of all of that data is also a really good indicator. Now looking backwards and trying to do the math. Can you talk a little bit about, you've been in staffing and recruiting for such a long time. Can you talk about the different decades or the different 5-year periods and how those 5-year periods have been different, and what versus now versus maybe 5 years ago, maybe versus 10 years ago? Can you talk a little bit about how staffing and recruiting has evolved and what the challenges have been for all of those periods?
It's interesting how it has changed over the last couple of decades. I've only spent about 11 years so far in staffing. So I saw the most recent few, I think, big phases. But I have some understanding of what took place before. The most recent 4 or 5 years have been some of the most interesting and perhaps challenging, I think, in staffing recent history, at least. Over the last several years, staffing industry has gone through effectively an industry-wide recession. Broad-based, it's been across most sectors that we've seen negative growth year over year over year, 3 years in a row, with even more negative outcomes on the bottom line. And we can talk about the causes for that, but I'd say the last few years have been amongst the most challenging for staffing. If we roll back the clock a little bit, staffing, most sectors were really challenged during COVID.
Right.
Some, of course, benefited, travel nursing, the most obvious case in point.
Right.
But then after COVID, staffing seemed to come roaring back. And then there was a very solid 12-month period. And then since then, it's just been an unending slide.
Yeah.
The 5 years or so leading up to COVID were actually pretty good. Solid, stable staffing business, decent growth, ranging from low single digits to double digits in some sectors. So that was a period of good stability, leading back all the way to basically the 07-08 recession, where there was also a really sharp contraction, but then followed by a sharp resurgence on the other end. So those, I would say, were all understandable and historically typical times. You'd expect if there's a broad economic contraction like during 01 or during 08 for the staffing industry to contract even more, because fundamentally you're providing swing labor at the margin, and so it ends up being a hyper-cyclical industry. The last 3 years, I'd say, has been atypical and much more mystifying, because there's just broad malaise that's not let up, and then there is some different structural factors, I think, driving that.
Yeah. We talked about how last 3 years there have been some definite structural changes, and also the sectors that have done well. Staffing and recruiting industry serving those sectors have not necessarily seen the benefits of those sectors doing well. Can you talk a little bit about what you think those structural changes are for this industry?
Yeah, I think a lot of folks in the industry have puzzled over this. Starting from the most powerful driver of staffing revenue historically, which is the temp labor penetration rate in the US. That has dropped now for more or less 3 years in a row, from 2.1, which is roughly what you'd expect in normal economic times like these, down to now about 1.5. Doesn't sound like a huge change at first glance, 60 basis points. But if you think of it as a percentage on a percentage,
Right.
it's dramatic for a large-ish industry like this. And it means that tens of billions of dollars of the industry has just disappeared.
Right.
Fundamentally, it means that managers in the US, labor managers and company managers, have elected to use a lot less formal temp labor. The temp labor penetration rate captures not just staffing, but also other kinds of temp labor, seasonal retail workers over Christmas and the holiday seasons, and then hospitality workers during the summer. But in general, in the US, there's been a dramatic contraction in the use of temp labor, and it's really impacted the staffing industry over the last 3 years. Now, what has driven that?
Right.
That's the multi-billion-dollar question. It seems to me that there are several factors that have played a role potentially. The one is just a general increase in the transparency of the labor market and in the liquidity of the labor market. Your transparency driven by legislation in some states requiring companies to post pay rates, for example, where previously the worker would have had to go through several rounds of interviews to discover the pay rates.
Right.
Then liquidity driven heavily by technology. There's so many tools that have matured over the last number of years that allow companies to find people and people to find companies in a much more easy way than used to be. And when markets become more liquid, as I think has happened to the labor market, in general, people playing a broker role in that market find that their role gets diminished.
Right. The arbitrage goes away.
It does. And I think that's been a significant factor. The other factor is there's been a reduction in, let's call it the friction involved in bringing people into a company and then also sending them out of a company again. A part of the staffing value proposition was, if you know that you're only going to need workers for a particular project for 3 months or 6 months, better to have a staffing company onboard them, employ them, and then offboard them at the end of the project, because there's a certain amount of work involved in bringing them into your company, inducting them, onboarding, and so on. A lot of that has become self-service through sophisticated technology platforms. So it's become a lot easier for companies to bring people on and then also to offboard them again. because of these platforms, which means, again, you've got less need for somebody to help you with that service if you can do it comparatively easily in-house. So there's a more liquid market. There's a reduction in the friction involved in employing people for a short period of time, which reduces the need for a service around that. And then finally, there's the availability of alternatives. If you look at the sophistication of the offshore offerings these days, if you go back a decade or two, in order to avail yourself of the labor arbitrage, you had to create a captive entity. There were only a small handful of vendors to deal with. It was a complex process. The vendors offshore have become so sophisticated and so easy to deal with, so easy to find, that even really small companies can have a portion of their labor force offshore and scattered around the world in advantaged geos. So you add all of that up, and it gets you to an uncomfortable place for the US staffing industry, where their role is diminished because of a more liquid market. Their role is diminished because of reduction in the friction that they use to resolve for clients. And finally, the need for them in the US is reduced because there are such strong offshore alternatives.
Yeah, absolutely.
So whether those are all the factors, I don't know, but I think they're a significant number.
Yeah.
And then there's also a general degree of uncertainty. And that means that companies have been postponing some of the projects for which they would typically, in IT and so on, use temporary labor. And that uncertainty has not helped the staffing industry. So you add it all up, and it's been a very uncomfortable few years. But quite a number of these factors, I think, are structural, and are here to stay.
Yeah, absolutely. This decline, there was this steady decline staffing and recruiting in this industry over the last few decades. The three things, the structural changes that you've mentioned, the cracks were already being seen 10 years ago. Why do you think now the impact has hit us so hard?
I think it's a confluence of things that all came together, some with a longer run-up. I think the impact of technology has been building for a long time. You used to have a proprietary database on little cards, and that was part of your value proposition. And then you had a proprietary database on a server in your basement. But these days, everybody has access with very little effort to extraordinary databases that capture a really large part of the available labor. And then with the advent of AI, that's made searching through those databases even more effective, where you can take a unstructured job description and match it with really high degrees of precision, almost in real time, against unstructured resumes, millions of them potentially. That's made the technology impact even stronger. But even some of the other factors has contributed to the liquidity in the marketplace. We went from a society where work from home was at a certain stable level, and then we went through COVID, and it jumped to a different level.
Yeah.
And the pendulum has swung back a little bit, but we still seem to be stabilizing at a completely different place in terms of work from home. And that makes things very different for companies that used to have to find somebody in a radius around where they wanted them to work, or somebody who was prepared to move there.
Right.
Many jobs, they can now look nationally.
Yeah.
And if you're suddenly searching through a national pool, it's a lot easier to find the candidates than if you're just searching within that radius.
Yeah. And also a lot easier to convince people to work for you, because you no longer need to move. You no longer need to make big changes. It's just, it's changing your laptop to another company's laptop, essentially.
That's exactly right. So with a more liquid labor market that's been created by these factors, and perhaps the impetus of COVID, that also caused companies to think more strongly about offshore, because once they realize that they can do a lot more from home, then the next logical step is to realize you could also do it from a different country.
Right.
And there's some great options in the same time zone if you want to go near shore. Across Latin America, that's now very accessible. And then, of course, there's far shore options. So all of these are structural changes that I think were to some extent accelerated by COVID or accelerated by the advent of AI. They all came together.
Yeah.
But they came together with a very powerful
with the right
cumulative impact.
force.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Can we do a little deeper dive, go a bit more micro? And can you tell me about how you're seeing, science, engineering, technology roles versus other roles like nursing and or teaching and, some of the other generic light industrial? Can you tell me a little bit, can you shed more light on the differences and how those roles are evolving and changing?
Well, that opens a very interesting set of questions because now we're talking about how the roles themselves will change, not just the general impact on the staffing industry of these factors. And there, I think we've seen some indications already, but intuitively, roles that involve a significant degree of physical skill and require you to be physically present to provide the service, such as nursing, such as some of the skilled trades and so forth. Those seem to be likely more stable, more impervious to AI disintermediation, and will likely remain so for a while. Now, eventually we'll get humanoid robots and things may change again, but that's
Still a decade away or more. When we will be in production.
so it would seem. But some of the other roles that are relatively structured in their output and that don't require a great deal of constant human interaction seems to be the ones that are most vulnerable to disintermediation by or disruption by AI. The most obvious example seems to be computer programmers, kind of entry-level programming roles. If you look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics data over the last 24 months, those roles seem to have declined by over 20% in the US, which is an epic change for a particular job category, particularly a large one in the US. Now, the good news is, in that same time period, InfoSec analyst and software architect roles have grown dramatically, double digits. So there's a dramatic realignment in what people spend their time on. And you could argue a positive realignment because they're involved in more interesting intellectual pursuits than entry-level programming. But I also think the impact is perhaps not taking place in the way that one might easily visualize, where a programmer is simply replaced by an AI agent. Software programmers all work in these sophisticated integrated development environments. And these things, from my day when I wrote code, I was basically in a text editor with maybe a little bit of highlighting. These days, these things are so sophisticated. They do all sorts of checking and other services in real time. You could pull in libraries, provide entire chunks of boilerplate code. And they were tools that were really well suited to AI enhancement. And so I think the tools got really much better very quickly. Programmers happen to be a population that's exceptionally well suited to adopting those, embracing those tools. So you had the perfect match there of kind of AI-enabled tools and a population particularly well suited to embracing those. And so I think what's happened is that programmers just became a lot more productive.
Absolutely.
So I don't think the way to think about it is that a company had 10 programmers and it replaced 3 of them with AI.
Right.
It had 10 programmers producing a certain output. It discovered that it could generate that output with 7 programmers because they've all become so much more productive.
Right. Absolutely. It's the same thing that happened with our company, actually. When we developed QLU.ai, it took us 2 years to develop QLU.ai, which was our parent variant of the tool.
Mm-hmm.
And then for the last year and a half, we've worked on developing QLU.3. But QLU.3 is 80 times more lines of code. So it's a significantly larger product suite than QLU.2, and it's developed in the same amount of time with the same amount of workforce. Now, what's happening is that we used to hire a lot of junior programmers. We used to bring them up to speed so that they could become senior programmers. But for QLU.ai, we didn't need to hire any junior programmers. We just didn't have the bandwidth. And we said, all right, we don't need someone to do the basic checking stuff or the writing the basic modules. AI would do that. What do you think is the future for people that are entering this field? I mean, if you don't have a starting job, how are you going to be an advanced programmer if you don't have a starting job?
Well, it's an interesting question, and I think the answer is the definition of a starting job is simply going to change.
Right.
You'll have to be trained, and you'll have to be ready to step in at a different level.
Right.
A more cognitively sophisticated level. And ultimately that should lead to a more fulfilling career because you're doing more interesting things. But it does mean that your education and your training and your experience will have to become geared to making you more ready to step in as, in this particular instance, a software architect,
right,
or at least a advanced programmer,
right,
versus a junior programmer.
Absolutely.
And it means you need to be trained on a different set of skills and a different set of tools. But, you could argue the same thing has happened with programmer over the years. Go back far enough and programmers had to write code in assembler or some really low-level language and compile the thing, debug the thing. The job is very different even from today's entry-level programmer. So I think it just means that the definition of what is entry-level is changing all the time.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right. I do feel, though, that this time around, that colleges and universities need to pick up a much larger portion of being able to train the workforce. And it's a lot more substantially different than, learning another newer language that rides at a higher abstraction of code. So I think colleges are going to get disrupted. A lot of computer science engineers or people that want to write code, I think it'll be very difficult for them to justify going to a university the way it is right now. Actually, 3-4 of our top 10 programmers, they actually don't have a university degree. They just taught themselves how to code.
Yeah.
So interesting thing. I think colleges are going to get disrupted. I'd love for you to touch upon the AI maturity curve in staffing. The augmentation, automation, and autonomy, where it's like I'm augmenting some of my work, and then, all the way to where big tasks within the recruiting and staffing can fully be automated. Can you tell me about, from your point of view, from your bird's eye view, staffing and recruiting, where are we now, and what do we need to do to keep moving up this curve?
It's a great question. And the tools have gotten spectacularly better over the last decade or two in staffing. The search through database have got fantastically better, but also the tools that allow you to stay in touch with people, to reach out to many people at the same time. Automation tools that allowed you to submit a number of simple questions and maybe even branch from answers within that to do simple screenings have been well established. But we are now moving to a very exciting phase.
Right.
If you think through the value chain in staffing, you start from your job description, and now you're searching through a large database of people, finding the matches. Well, AI can take care of that for you.
Right.
You create a short list of candidates, and then you need to reach out to those candidates and see if they're interested and do an initial screen. And of course, AI can do that for you as well. Then you want to do some more in-depth interviews with your top candidates. And increasingly, the AI interviewing tools are extraordinarily good.
Right.
And you will know this extremely well. But the sophistication of the interviews, the awkward pauses seem to be gone. The strange non sequitur questions seem to be gone. The probing follow-up questions have become much better. So AI interviewing is a legitimately powerful tool now. Now, where does this leave one? I think it means that there's still a significant part of the value proposition of a recruiter or a staffing company, which has to do with managing the client relationship, understanding the client expectations, managing the relationship with the candidate, brokering the relationship between the two, and ultimately consummating a win-win transaction where both sides are happy. There's much more of that sort of activity. The more sophisticated the role in general, the more the role pays.
Right.
But at the one end of the spectrum, where roles are comparatively simple, where the screening is comparatively simple, much of that one can see being fully automated with the AI tools you have available today. And then a spectrum where at the other end, if you're placing some very advanced, very sophisticated roles, if you're placing roles where cultural fit is a huge part of the story, if you're placing people who have many options or clients who are extremely picky and the job description is only half of what they're going to evaluate the candidate on,
Right.
then I think there's still a very strong role to play for recruiters,
Right.
To make ultimately that human-to-human match in a way that leaves both sides content.
Absolutely. So in essence, what you're saying is that at the higher end, there's still going to be a need for humans to be part of the process. And at the lower end, it can potentially be fully automated. We're still far away from that. We have the technology, we have all the tools independently that work really well. Why do you think there's still a gap in adoption?
It's partly simply familiarity. And there's three parties that need to be comfortable with this. The recruiter,
Right.
who has a legitimate fear that this might ultimately impact their job if they're only going to stay at that one particular segment where there's a lot of automation potential. They're hesitant to embrace this.
Right.
The client is somewhat hesitant to embrace this because they've been talking to, in many cases, a particular recruiter for years, and they're very comfortable with their way of working. And then, of course, for the candidate, there's a degree of uncertainty with this. So all of that will mean this will take a little while to embrace. But that is the future. That there's going to be a high degree of automation at the one end of the spectrum. I don't think there's much doubt, particularly in roles that where you can also rely on external certification, roles that are very short-term in nature, but where there's very specific certifications required, where some of the other factors may just not be as significant.
Right. There are three parties that we're seeing that are potential users of AI. There's the client that themselves are potentially adopting AI for interviewing and recruiting. There are staffing and recruiting companies that are old players. It's an old dog needs to learn new tricks. And then there's this new breed of organizations that are basically AI firms, software firms, and they're saying, we're going to do all the recruiting for you end to end. We're going to do your staffing. We're going to do your recruiting using AI agents. In your view, how do you think the space is going to evolve? And who's going to win the race on this front? Will there be any definite winner? Will all of these three players have a place? How do you foresee this 10 years from now if we look back, listen to our podcast? What are your predictions on this front?
I think it does pose real challenges for the staffing company, in that as the technology tools evolve, but they also become ubiquitously available to their clients.
Right.
It does mean that certain things for the clients are becoming easier. We talked earlier about the fact that some of the friction has gone out of hiring and then terminating people, which reduces some of the staffing value proposition. But also the great search tools, the great matching tools, the screening tools, all of these tools are just as available to the clients as they are to the staffing industry.
Right.
And if they make certain activities more easy to do, then clients will either insource them or they will expect a significant reduction in what they pay for these services because they understand that they're easier. So I think there's a both a volume potential challenge for staffing companies because of some degree of insourcing that will happen to these activities. And there is also a margin challenge because clients will expect to participate in the technology efficiencies that staffing companies are going to benefit from. In terms of the third group, the pure play tech companies, we've seen several waves of this in staffing.
Right.
And none of them have really panned out. So I think this time it's likely to play out as before,
Right.
where ultimately staffing companies are spurred and in some cases terrified into embracing these technologies quickly.
Right.
But the single most important thing that a staffing company still has in its corner is its client relationships.
Absolutely.
And so even if you are a tech player, you still have to have a sales force going out there, knocking on doors and convincing clients to give you the mandate to fill their jobs. Whereas the staffing companies, by and large, have that in place.
Right.
And so as long as they can evolve their service to be at least comparable to what the tech players are offering, it's difficult to see how they would be displaced in the client's mind.
Yeah.
In the client service roster by a pure play.
Yeah. I also believe that services business is very different from technology business. If you're a services business, even if you're technology enabled, you're a services business. In the way you think, the people you hire, the leaders that you have on your team need to be completely different. I can't tell you how many VCs tell me, oh, I think you need to change your business model and just go direct. And I say, no, you don't get it. I'm a tech SaaS guy. I am not a services person. Yeah. This is a completely different business. So VCs know very little. So I completely agree with you. As long as staffing and recruiting companies do adopt AI and make AI a big portion of their overall workflow, I think they're going to be fine. And as you mentioned, looking back history, all these new startups saying, oh, we're going to do everything for you, I don't think it's really going to work.
Yeah. I think, though, it's important to distinguish two things. They may not end up ceding a lot of market share to tech players if they embrace AI, if they evolve fast enough to stay relevant. But they may still find that the entire sector is contracted.
Right.
Because there's simply less demand for the volume. And they may find on top of that, there's significant price pressure. And in fact, that is what they are finding right now.
Right.
So it still could be a very challenged sector in which to run a great business.
Right.
Even if you're not being displaced by alternatives.
Yeah.
The AI side.
Absolutely. I think pricing pressures are definitely going to come through. And I was talking to somebody last week and he talked about whenever they get a check for a placement that they've done, what they do is they split that check up 50-50. They give 50% to the person who did the recruiting for the role and 50% to the salesperson that brought in the role. And I said, well, potentially the cost of recruiting is going to go down significantly, but the cost of sales, like the sales guy still has to make the effort. So isn't that unfair? And he immediately paused. He said, wow, we need to completely rethink our pay plan, right? Because recruiting is technically going to become a lot easier. And a recruiter can now maybe place 3 or 4 or 5 times the roles that they were traditionally placing.
Right.
Can you talk about how comp structures potentially might need to change?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And there's a lot of variation in the staffing industry. What you mentioned is certainly a construct that some companies believe in very firmly, like pay parity between recruiting and sales. And both sides end up earning a comparable percentage of the gross margin. Other firms have certainly gone in a different direction. And even over the cycle, before the most recent disruption, this has tended to change.
Right.
There's a time in the cycle where supply of talent is plentiful, recruiting becomes easier, and the sales role becomes more valuable. And then there's another time in the cycle where the sales become easier, especially if you're in that in that accelerated phase coming out of a recession.
Right.
And recruiting may be a little bit differently affected. So the value of the two roles changes depending on the cycle. But I think you're right that with some of the recent changes, it may be that ultimately the sales role structurally becomes more valuable, and that'll end up being reflected in
the compensation,
in the comp structures. There's also been a strong trend. It's more in the high volume, light industrial world and an entry-level professional world to move away from a heavy commission-based approach for recruiters,
right,
and move towards a somewhat higher base and a small bonus. And the belief was there's enough incentive with a small bonus, and that you can manage performance with metrics, and that therefore you don't need to have a comp structure that as strongly incents performance, because you can accomplish what you need to accomplish with metrics, and this is ultimately a better way to.
From your point of view, what does AI do to the quality of work? Right, a lot of recruiters, you've seen your top performers, your top tier performers who are produce really high quality of work. You have your mid tier. Everything is a bell curve, right? In life we've learned. How do you think AI is going to change the quality of work? And number one, quality of work, two-pronged question, and the quality of people that are being recruited.
Into the recruiting role, you mean? Or
yes,
for clients?
For clients.
For clients. So that's a very interesting question. In terms of the quality of people that'll be recruited for clients, given the sophistication of the tools, the breadth of the databases, the sophistication of the matching, one would think that you would be producing candidates for your clients that are a more precise match to what they want. Now, if you are talking about a very experienced recruiter that's been doing this for a long time, they are making really high quality matches anyway today.
Right.
Well before AI.
Right.
Because they were just really good at it.
Right.
And so whether the quality of their matching will improve, one can probably debate a bit.
Right.
But for somebody just starting out, for somebody also perhaps in the middle of the pack performance-wise, you would think these tools would provide a significant boost, because if they give you a short list of 10 to choose from, and all 10 are somewhere between a 8 or a 9 or a 10
right,
on a 10-point scale in terms of the caliber of the match. And previously they started with a short list that had much broader kind of variance, then you'd think even new recruiters would find it easier to do great matching.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Now, within staffing and recruiting, there's a lot of different business models. There's the statement of work model, there's the RPO model, there's a, contingency model. How do you think those business models are going to evolve?
Well, I think that's pretty clear. From the last few years, the trend has been absolutely unambiguous. There is volume pressure and margin pressure on the traditional staffing approach. And that pressure is more significant for staffing companies presenting as a generalist. Clients, I think, are clearly signaling they value specialization.
Right.
They value narrow specialists, and they would prefer to buy from several narrow specialists than from one generalist. But I think what we've seen over the last few years is that the client preferences have evolved even more significantly than that towards solutions. One can talk about why solutions, particularly right now, are finding favor. But I think in general, it has to do with the fact that it's a very and increasingly complex world.
Right. Can you elaborate on what solutions means? What is solutions?
Yeah. So this is an interesting question, because a lot of staffing companies are rushing headlong into what they call SOW business, statement of work business. And with good reason, there has been all else being equal, significantly more growth there than in traditional staffing, classic contingent labor and perm.
Right.
But a solution or an SOW can be written to simply say, I will provide 5 people with these skills. It could even be written saying, I will provide 1 person with this name, with these skills,
right,
and nothing else. And that really is staffing by just a slightly different name and wrapper. Now, if you're providing 5 people with a particular skill set unnamed, so that you're responsible for backfilling and always maintaining that team of 5, now you've provided a bit more value than if you were just to provide 5 named individuals.
Right.
If you're providing 5 people with a degree of technical oversight from your side to make sure that they operate, in accordance with proper standards, or even a degree of management oversight, now you're providing more value. If you're ultimately saying, I'm going to guarantee their work product,
right,
we will deliver a piece of software, we will deliver an engineering design or whatever the case may be, and my fee will be contingent on me delivering that successfully, so that you're taking outcome risk, you're providing a lot more value.
Absolutely.
And then you can go even further and take responsibility for entire activities inside a client. So broadly speaking, I think there's the 3 kinds of solution. The simplest is simply, my solution is I'm providing a team of people with a particular skill profile.
Right.
The next stop over is I'm providing a project outcome. The most sophisticated is I'm taking responsibility for an entire function in your organization.
Yeah.
And on an indefinite basis, I will perform that function, and there will be an expectation of continuous improvement, full-blown outsourcing.
Right.
So I think staffing companies who are seeking to protect their growth and who are moving into this SOW direction generally are doing the right thing.
Right.
But it's not as simple as simply wrapping your existing staffing service inside an SOW. There's more to it than that. But that allows you to walk into the client through the professional services door,
right,
as opposed to the contingent labor door, which particularly with large, sophisticated clients, where that might be run by a combination of procurement and talent acquisition, tends to be a heavily RFP'd, kind of low margin, heavily commoditized activity. Versus if you walk in through the professional services door, there's typically a lot more room to create interesting outcomes, win-win situations, more attractive margin profiles,
right,
and so
on. To go down this path, it sort of ties back into what previously you'd mentioned, that our clients are looking for hyper-specialization anyway. And so do you think that's the pathway that staffing and recruiting companies need to do to be able to create a solutions model, is create those hyper-specializations within their organizations?
Yeah, I think not everywhere you need hyper-specialization, but do you need to walk in with your value proposition, not just I can go and find talent, but actually I know some stuff about your particular problem area, about your industry vertical, about your technical issues. Yes, I think you need to develop that knowledge in-house so that you walk in and you're not just somebody who can find talent, but you also have a degree of IP and a degree of understanding that goes beyond the superficial.
Right.
So what I see staffing companies doing, there's 2 things if you really want to walk down the SOW path and start stepping into the project outsourcing or the full-blown outsourcing world, that you need to build up. You need to build into your organization internal technical expertise.
Right.
It doesn't mean you need to overnight go and hire a huge bench of experts.
Yeah.
That's a very expensive model where suddenly utilization becomes your primary driver of success, and it's a different skill set from what most staffing companies have. But if you're in IT and if you're in InfoSec in IT, then you should have a few people that are your permanent employees that are deep experts in that,
right,
and who can lead the discussions with the clients about specific needs.
Right.
The other critical skill that you need to build out is you need to have folks who can actually structure and price these projects. If you are going to start taking outcomes risk, it's also really easy to start losing money on projects.
Right.
And project structuring, pricing, scoping, managing things like change orders become part of your existence, and you need to know how to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. That it almost seems like for the staffing and recruiting industry, given also now with the pressures from AI, where a lot of the basic recruiting, the interviewing, all of that can be automated. This seems to be the path where they can really protect their turf, or at least a big chunk of where they can really protect their turf.
I think that's exactly right. If a lot of their traditional activities are either automatable or not as valuable as they used to be,
Right.
one would think that frees up a degree of intellectual bandwidth inside the staffing company to build the technical expertise, to build the project management expertise, the project scoping and pricing expertise. So those companies that can, and those companies that have shifted their model in that direction, are clearly emerging as more successful in staffing.
Yeah.
And again, it doesn't mean you need to run all the way to a fully bench-based consulting model, because most staffing companies do not have the skills to make that transition
Right.
overnight, and there's a lot of risk associated with that. But something in the middle, where you have a degree of technical expertise, a degree of project management expertise, but you still are relying on a staffing model to assemble teams in a just-in-time way around some of these experts that you have in-house to deliver outcomes. That's a path that I think staffing companies can walk down very successfully.
So when we talked before, you had mentioned that developing IP as part of a partnership with any vendor is very, very important for you. Can you shed some light on why that is? And oh, by the way, I completely agree with you now. I absolutely agree. Developing IP is extremely important.
So I'm a huge believer in the importance of developing things that you know distinctively well, that allow you to develop and ultimately deliver services in a unique and differentiable way. If you don't have any intellectual property in your company around processes that you have refined to a very sophisticated place, or systems that you have either developed or just customized to a very sophisticated place, then the service that you're going to provide is by definition going to be generic.
Right.
So there's different kinds of IP that I think is important in the staffing space. I think understanding specific industry verticals so that you can walk in there and be knowledgeable is important. That's client-related IP. Having within that technical knowledge so that you can walk in as a technical expert is important. And developing those kinds of IP goes a long way to setting you up for success in a more SOW-driven world. But there's other kinds of IP around how you recruit, how you find talent, how you onboard people, how you train your salespeople, and how you configure your systems to support all of these things in an optimal way. That's critical. And as you work with partners, working with the partner so that you take what their offering is and enhance it to your particular circumstances in a way
Right.
ultimately you can claim some degree of ownership around. That just makes you a more defendable and a more robust business.
Yeah, absolutely. Along those same lines, do you have any thoughts on data and data as a moat, the data that's being captured? There's so much that is happening. There's conversations between recruiters. There's conversations with candidates. There's conversations with clients. All of that data sort of, doesn't get captured. Do you think that there's value in data capture? And is data potentially a moat that can be used by the staffing and recruiting industry?
I think it is, but perhaps not in the way that it's been traditionally thought about. Traditionally, folks thought of your valuable data as your database of candidates and maybe the outcomes around that so that you know which candidates are successful and which are not. And that's certainly valuable data, but it's not distinctive or differentiable data,
Right.
for the most part. But there is data that gets to the idea of proprietary AI training sets that become interesting.
Right.
As you say, your recruiters are in conversations with, if it's a large staffing company, hundreds or thousands of people a week potentially.
Right.
every one of those conversations is a source of interesting insight.
Absolutely.
And it's not really a source that could be readily mined until now.
Right.
I don't know that folks are yet mining the value of that information.
Mm.
And even discussions with clients, there are some really elegant tools available now on the market that will listen in on your sales conversations,
Right.
and help your salespeople get better,
Right.
and help you sharpen your value proposition and understand how better to overcome objectives or objections in particular situations.
Right.
This is the kind of data that I think is actually the really valuable data.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you. There's this currently, the way the models are trained is what we call domain experts. And domain experts come in, they do a bunch of labeling, and they train the model.
Mm-hmm.
And then that information is then used to create synthetic data to do very extensive training of the model. But almost always that extensive data will never really have the fine-tuned, the really human conversations, or the really, things that happen at the human level.
Mm-hmm.
That information, those workflows, those data capture doesn't happen. And I think all of this data is not even being captured right now. So staffing and recruiting companies, in my mind, are sitting on Goldmine, the conversations that are happening on a day-to-day basis, and they don't know that they're sitting on a Goldmine.
No, it's amazing, but you're right. The LLMs out there seems to have ingested everything that's available on the open internet at this point.
Right.
So we can take that as kind of a baseline knowledge they all have. But it gets much more interesting if you can, in real time, have them participate in your business conversations,
Right.
and become smarter and smarter by the day on your particular area.
Right. Absolutely. So, you've implemented a lot of different systems. You've acquired a lot of different companies which have had their own different systems. And what is your thought process when you're thinking of IT infrastructure investment, the build versus buy decision? Traditionally, that has always been picking, Group A's tech stack versus Group B's tech stack. Can you give me a high-level overview of your decision framework when you think about these things for teams?
This is a big conversation, potentially. I will say I continue to be amazed at how expensive these stacks are to build in the staffing space, and how long they take. It feels to me like we're still stuck in a previous paradigm around building out elaborate ERP implementations and immense HRIS systems and hooking them up through thousands of hours of work to applicant tracking systems and CRM systems. But the price tags you see for staffing companies building out a stack are still in the tens of millions of dollars for large staffing companies. I find this really mystifying.
Right.
Because fundamentally, the things these systems do, I mean, to say they're not rocket science is a really understatement.
Yeah.
This is not calculus. It's not even math. It's barely arithmetic.
Right.
And yet it's that expensive.
Absolutely.
So there, I think, is an opportunity for really significant disruption.
Absolutely.
This is something I think you and I have talked about a little bit, but if we look down the road some ways, at some point, your AI is going to be your personal interface with which you want to interact with the world. And instead of you having to learn the interfaces of lots of different systems every time they cross your path through your career or in life, your AI will learn the systems.
Right.
And your AI will learn the interfaces and reproduce it for you in a way that's comfortable for you to engage with.
Right.
But that means that a lot of these systems potentially will be relegated to just systems of record and transactional systems.
Mm-hmm.
And they will push deeper into the stack and become somewhat invisible. because your AI will replicate the interface and
Right.
know what you want to do. But then you can go a little further and say, well, if the AI understands the interface and it understands eventually everything that flows to you that you need to interpret, and then from you to take action on, perhaps it can start replicating the backends.
Right.
And just recreating a lot of these things.
Right.
I think part of the reason why some of these things are so difficult to implement for staffing companies and so expensive is because you're taking a system that was developed and overdeveloped over the years into some generic, gigantic behemoth that can do an unbelievably complex set of things. So the tech stack build out in the staffing world, if you're a large staffing company, to me seems still extraordinarily expensive and complex. The bill for building out a complete staffing company tech stack, if you're a large player, could run to tens of millions of dollars and stretch across multiple years. And you may be hooking together some complicated ERP or HRIS system and an applicant tracking system and a CRM system and a host of other peripheral systems. And the reason I think it becomes so expensive and so complex is you're taking systems that were designed to be incredibly generic and incredibly powerful, and you're using 5% of one and 10% of the other. But you're having to configure and pay for the whole 100%. And that's why it becomes such a major operation to build out and change your tech stack. Now, if you look a little ways down the future, you might end up with an AI that you grow up with and get used to that becomes your personal interface to all things technological.
Right.
And instead of you having to learn the various interfaces of systems that you encounter through life, your AI will learn those interfaces, present it to you in a way that you're comfortable with, and eventually understand what data you need to consume from this interface and what decisions you need to make and data you need to feed back into it to get work done. And so all these systems could get pushed down and relegated to being just transactional systems of record without much by way of an interface that a person interacts with, because the AI will configure the interface in a way that matches you.
Right.
But of course, once the AI understands that interface and understands the data flowing in and out of it, it could start figuring out how to recreate that back end.
Absolutely.
And recreate just the 5% of this system and the 10% of that system that you actually really need.
Absolutely.
So I'm pretty excited about a day where a staffing company can say to an AI, this is what we want to do. And the AI figures out the interfaces customized to the individuals by talking to their personal AIs, and then also figures out the back end and creates the whole thing in a much more cost-effective way, and hopefully also much more adaptable and configurable way.
Yeah.
The fact that you need to have projects run into multi-year timelines to do an overhaul of an existing tech stack just doesn't feel like you're even close to the speed at which your business is evolving.
Absolutely. In fact, I would say I think that future is an absolute reality. And I would say what can even happen is the AI observes how each and every single worker within each and every single group works and how different business units work. And then the AI, having observed a team or a business or a person for a quarter, for a month, for a week, their high cycles and low cycles, create a very custom package that fulfills both the company's requirements, the business unit's requirements, and then also me personally as a worker.
Yeah.
So there is no system of record. It's a system of action where it does all the work, does a lot of the work for me, keeps me moving towards my KPIs, and also does all the reporting for me without me having to do all of that work. So yeah, I think CRMs, ATS systems, ERP systems, they're going to be toast. I think it's just a matter of time before people are going to start figuring this out. I want to end our conversation with one final question. you've gone through many different careers. You've, been on the very engineering hardcore side. You've done business consulting, hardcore business work. You've managed P&L. For someone that is scared about AI is going to replace them, what would be your advice to them? Both either starting out from college or people that are, in the middle of their career and still have like another 20 years to go.
Yeah, I think specifically with relates to fear of AI, my advice would be embrace AI. Go use it. Go play with it. It's out there. It's free, or pay the $20 a month to get the enhanced version. But go use it, because it's unlikely for most people that they will be replaced by AI.
Right.
But they might be replaced by somebody else who uses AI better than they do.
Correct.
And the great thing, if you start using it and playing with it, not only will you discover all sorts of interesting ways to make your life easier and in which this thing can help you, you'll also develop a more realistic appreciation of its limitations. Because much as it is fun to talk about the future, if you work with AI today, there's still some dramatic challenges before it becomes what we think it eventually will become. The one that I run into most frequently is the hallucination issue.
Right.
And I don't know how they're going to fix that.
Yeah.
But it's real.
Right.
And it's dramatic. And I've had hilarious cases where I asked the thing, please talk to me about this particular company and give me an assessment of their strengths, their weaknesses, their product set, and so forth. And I misspelled the company name. And the AI, instead of correcting the misspelling, invented an entire fictitious company and did a complete assessment of their product lines, all completely made up.
Right.
So we're still in a world like that, where the trust that you'd need to get to that future that I think we're both excited about, where the AI can simply create the system to support a particular business activity.
Right.
That trust, I think, still has a degree of building and validation.
Absolutely
needed.
Hallucinations, using that example, just to solve hallucinations requires a lot of money. There's a lot of checking and cross-checking, which means you're spending a lot of tokens in serving your query. And imagine hundreds of millions of people doing this. It's very, very expensive value proposition. So I completely agree with you. I think in order for AI to become really, really real, problems like hallucinations need to be solved, which means that the cost of token generation still needs to go down. And there's a long way to go where tokens still need to become a lot more inexpensive. So I think it's going to be a curve. It won't be, and that gives us humans time to learn AI and to interact with it and to figure out how to use it in their day-to-day work. So it won't be all of a sudden where things are replaced. Hugo, thank you so much for your time. This was wonderful. As always, our conversations are so thought-provoking. I hope we can do this again.
Very much my pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you.